Hi, everybody. So this week you have a few things going on. The first thing you have going on is, of course, your exam on Thursday, and I expect that that will feature fairly heavily in terms of your preparation for the week. I also wanted to touch base on some other projects that you have going on, specifically to touch a little bit on Phase 4, which is going to be due next week, and to also revisit the group project and what I'm asking you to do. Because I'm not going to be presenting new content this week, this is a potential opportunity to play a little bit of catch up on some of these projects in addition to studying for your exam. So your exam will be on Thursday, and one of the things that I recommend is that you think through setting up a video conferencing session with me on Tuesday or Wednesday if you need to touch base on your particular project. I would especially encourage this for people who have yet to do work on their Phase 3 and are still working on that particular part of their project, and who really need to get in some face time with me in order to finalize what it is that they're doing and identify specific challenges that they have so that they can get caught up. But if you have additional things that you want to touch base with me on about, for example, your group project, or as you're diving into Phase 4, you have questions about that, once again, that would be a great opportunity for you to set up a FaceTime meeting with me. I would also like to say that you don't want to save this for the last minute. I had some requests for video conferencing late Friday afternoon, evening, on the day that Phase 3 was due. I'm not going to be able to set up these meetings at the last minute. So really think about setting up meetings with me earlier in the week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are going to work the best for me. And because your exam is on Thursday, it would probably work best to set up video conferencing with me this week for Tuesday or Wednesday. So as a reminder, Phase 4 is where you start working on your methods section. Some of you were a little bit confused while you were working on your Phase 3 and started working on your methods section there. This is what Phase 4 is. You're going to be writing a detailed methods section as part of your draft of your proposal. Keep in mind that because this is a proposal, I want you to use future tense because it's anticipated. So it's not people that you've run in the study, it's people that you plan on running. It's not here's what we did, it's here's what I plan to do. Does that make sense? So you have different sections in your paper. The first section of your methods section is participants. Keep in mind that each of these sections would be considered major headings within the methods section. So I'm going to go through a very brief overview of those headings and APA style next week as you prepare for your Phase 4. But just to kind of keep that in mind, you can think of participants as a section within methods that would have its own label. And we'll go through how to format those headings once again next week. For your participants, you can assume that you'd be recruiting Gen Psych students for your participant pool, that you'd be running them for research credit, and that you'd be recruiting them by putting up your research times on the bulletin board and having people show up to your sessions that way. You can also recruit friends to participate in your study, and keep in mind that sometimes your study might require special populations or requirements. So for example, you might be only targeting a specific gender, or you might be recruiting people of a certain ethnicity to participate in your study, or a certain affiliation. For example, are they involved in sports or not? And so just keep in mind if your study has special requirements for the study's participants that you should outline that in the participants section. The design is another section of your paper. I'm going to go ahead and revisit the notation system that we'll use so that you can work on your design in the lecture next week. So just expect that to be part of the lecture for next week's content. One of the things this means is that you'll want to watch the section on design while you're working on your Phase 4 and keep that in mind. You'll also want to make sure to watch that before you work on that part of your Phase 4 and not save it all for the last minute. So for your procedure section, you're basically going to be going through a detailed description of what participants are going to be experiencing during the course of your study. If you are adapting your procedure from another source, then you're going to cite that source. So this was adapted from this particular source. During the course of your description, you're going to identify your various groups and walk through what they will experience. If they are undergoing different instructions or different experiences, then you need to explain how they will differ in detail. If you're providing different instructions to them, describe how the instructions will differ from one another, and just make sure that it's very clear what the different conditions will experience. You might want to label the different conditions and walk through each one in turn. I want you to go through the procedure in temporal order. So for example, first they did this, first they will do this, then they will do that, then they will do this other thing. So put it in order in terms of how they will experience things. When it comes to talking about your measures, I want you to mention your measures when you are measuring them in your procedure. So then participants will fill out this scale and mention the scale by name. I want you to describe the scale in much further detail in your materials section later in your paper, so for now you're just going to name drop it. If you are taking a scale from another source, which I strongly recommend that you do, you're going to cite that measure. And there's a particular way that we cite a measure of a named scale, and this is what we do. So the first time you cite it, the very first time, what you do is you provide the full name of the scale and the acronym, and you provide the citation of the source. So for example, this is the dispositional envy scale, and I would write it out in full and then provide the acronym DES following it in parentheses, as well as the citation. In subsequent mentions, you only need to provide the acronym because everyone will know that DES stands for the dispositional envy scale. But the first time you mention a scale, provide the full name and also the acronym. And once again, if it's a cited scale, then provide the citation for it. You can take a look at the forgiveness reading, the Noreen article, and in order to see examples of cited scales. So Noreen uses cited scales, and you can see how they format it as an example of this. Keep in mind that your goal is that someone else should be able to read the procedure and create the study that you had in mind. So you want to be as explicit as possible in describing what people are going through. I expect your procedure section to be detailed and thorough. And once again, it will be in the future tense. It's something you plan to do. I also want you to include a section where you go over risk assessment. This is explicitly because I'm going to be asking you to fill out an IRB form as part of your project next semester. And I want you to have this so that you can include it in your IRB form. This involves identifying any possible risk. Keep in mind that inducing stress or being uncomfortable are potential risks, as well as revealing personal information that can once again make people feel uncomfortable. So sometimes, even though you might not think there is a great deal of risk, there's always a small degree of risk that somebody might be put on the spot or feel uncomfortable about revealing personal information. And some studies have a slightly higher degree of risk in terms of inducing a higher degree of stress or discomfort. I want you to think through how you are mitigating that risk. So very common ways of mitigating risk include providing instructions on the informed consent form and verbally that participants can skip any question that they choose to not answer for any reason, and that they can also stop the study without penalty and can leave at any time. Providing those particular broad statements can make it possible for people to not answer questions that make them feel too uncomfortable. And making sure that they know their rights, that they can stop the study without penalty, is another way of once again mitigating risk. I want you to identify why your study qualifies as minimal risk. So keep in mind that minimal risk is the risk encountered on a daily basis. It's not no risk, it's minimal risk. So is this resembling what people could expect to encounter during the course of your normal day? I want you to go ahead and clarify why your study is classified as minimal risk. Even if it might appear to be obvious to you, you will need to go ahead and talk with the IRB members about that. And so being able to articulate why your study is minimal risk is important. I also want you to have a section on participant confidentiality, where I want you to think through how your responses will remain confidential. This is also in the exercise of potentially having to fill out an IRB form about this later. So I want you to think through Confidentiality. Keep in mind that part of confidentiality is making sure that people's personal identity is not linked with their data. So if, for example, you're passing out questionnaires, you want to make sure that those questionnaires do not include a space for participants to write their name, and that any material that does include their name, like an informed consent form, would be a separate piece of information that would be stored separately. So it would be on a separate piece of paper, the informed consent form that would include their signature and name, and you would store it in a separate folder than your questionnaire data. It's important to think through the type of data that you're recording. If, for example, you're video recording, which I don't think anyone is doing, then how will that data be kept secure in order to keep people's information from being leaked or from them being identified later? Who will see that data? Who will interact with that data? And how will the data be secured? So it's important to think through how the data will be stored. Now, one of the things that I can provide for you, for example, is a designated filing cabinet that's going to be in a location that will be locked in the evening. And this designated filing cabinet can be a place where you can store your data and be assured of its relative security. I would say bringing it home with you is not necessarily keeping it secure. If you were collecting data using something like SurveyMonkey, then you would be able to qualify that the data on SurveyMonkey is kept in a secure password protected area. Does that make sense? So really thinking through your data and how you'll keep your data secure is a part of this process, and I want you to start thinking about it. We'll go through this in a lot more detail next semester, but at least giving a start is a good place to be at this particular stage of your project. When it comes to your materials, I want you to provide a section of your methods section that provides more detail about each questionnaire. Now, I don't want you to copy and paste the questionnaire into the text of your paper. That's what the appendices are for. So you're going to be appending the full questionnaire as a part of this phase, but you're going to be describing the questionnaire in your materials section. Once again, I recommend you look to the Noreen reading or to the Powell and Smith reading for descriptions of questionnaires in methods sections. But here's some information I want you to provide. So I would recommend that you separate each questionnaire into a subheading and identify it by name, and provide information such as the number of items, the anchors and range. What I mean is it a 1 to 7 scale? Is it a 1 to 5 scale? What does a 1 mean and what does a 5 mean? And does a 1 mean not at all and a 5 mean very much so? So go ahead and identify the anchors and the range as a part of this. Providing a sample item is considered to be fairly standard. And once again, you'd put that sample item in quotations. And I would recommend that you look to other sources to see how they're describing their items as an example so that you can kind of take that into account. And of course, you would cite the scale if needed. Your appendices are where you're going to provide a few things. So I want you to provide the scale that you plan to use in full. This might be challenging for some of you. So you might, for example, have a really great scale that you've identified that you want to use for your study, but it might be hard for you to track down. You might have a citation of the scale, and that might be a good starting place for you to go back to the database and search for it to see if you can find the original article where the scale has been published. This might mean that you make use of interlibrary loan. This is one of the reasons why I'm talking about this week, even though it's due next week, because it will take a couple days for you to maybe get that particular source. And it might take even longer because we're depending on librarians from other sites that might be working from home, and there might be a delay. So I would recommend that you do some digging this week in order to try to track down your scales so that you don't run into problems next week. If you're really struggling, ask me. I might have a copy of a scale that you can use available. But once again, I really do want you to make an attempt to find the original version of the scale. If it's cited, you can put that into the database, track down the original article, and if you can't get full access to it right away, request it through interlibrary loan. And oftentimes those articles will include the full questionnaire with all the items in it, and then you would provide those items in your appendices. I expect you to use other people's scales. Using other people's scales increases the validity of your own your own experiment. So if you're measuring self-esteem, I want you to use a highly publicized and recognized scale of self-esteem, like the Rosenberg or the Heatherton and Pahlavi self-esteem scale. I want you to use someone else's scale rather than trying to create your own scale. If you are measuring something that is deeply unique, that does not have a scale that other people have already created, you can of course create your own, but I really would like you to, whenever possible, source from other people. And if you've been doing a lot of reading about a particular topic, then it should mention scales that other people have developed. So I really do want you to track down these scales, which involves a little bit of research, energy, effort, and time. So once again, do not save this for the last minute. And you would provide the items from the scale and any scale instructions in your appendices. If you're doing a task, I would like you to go into a little bit more detail with your appendices. So if you have specific instructions or an example of the task, then that would be appropriate to include in your appendices. For example, if you are asking them to complete an unsolvable puzzle, I'd like to see an example of what that would look like. If you're giving them instructions that are specific for a speech, I expect you to describe those instructions in your methods section and then provide the full text of the instructions in your appendices. So the appendices are a place to really go into much more detail about the things you're having people do. If you are providing specific stimuli, for example, pictures or mock-ups of certain social media platforms, I want you to think through providing a mock-up. I don't necessarily want you to spend a great deal of time and energy on this. It can be a very simple version of what you're ultimately planning to do, but I would like to see what you're describing whenever possible. So if you're using pictures, I want to see an example of what that might look like. We'll go through APA style when it comes to appendices in some of the material next week. The other thing I wanted to touch base on was your group project, because I've changed that a little bit, and I wanted to make sure that we at least start talking about it so that maybe during this week, one of the things you can do is contact your group members and just see the state of your current project. Once again, if you need to get me your data, please do so. If not, you should already have your data analyzed and you should have access to your output. It might be a walk down memory lane to revisit some of that output. That would be another great opportunity for you to schedule a video conferencing session where you can share files with me and we can go through it together. So you can have two choices. You can either write a group paper or create a group PowerPoint file. I would highly recommend that you take the opportunity to use PowerPoint because I'm going to be far less picky about formatting, and for the paper I'm going to be expecting it to be in APA style, similarly to your reports from statistics. When you're doing PowerPoint, you would basically provide one slide per section of the paper. So a slide for your introduction, a slide for your methods, a slide for your results, and a slide for your discussion. So it should be fairly straightforward for you. If you would like to provide narration like I'm doing, then you can record the slideshow where you would record for each one of your slides, and then you could send the recorded slideshow file to me. So you would save the PowerPoint file and send it, and it would save the recordings that you do. It would be really excellent if you could pull this off, but I'm not requiring it just because it would be a bit logistically challenging for you. So the very first slide would be introducing your topic, where you provide what the questionnaire was measuring, what your behavioral measure was, and your hypothesis for how you thought those two would be related. So you should have a specific direction in mind. We thought there would be a positive relationship between these two things, and then talk a little bit about why. For your methods section, I expect this to be one of the more detailed sections of your paper. So you'd provide the number of participants, the mean and standard deviation age, and the number of males and females, which should all be in your SPSS data file. I expect you to go into more detail about your scale creation. This might go into 2 slides, so you might have 2 slides for your method section. We talk a little bit about scale development, for example, how you generated your item pool, how you edited it with direction from me and while working with your fellow group members. And then you're going to talk about some of your scale's final state. So you're going to provide that final Chromebox alpha and talk about whether you dropped any items from your scale at that stage of your analysis in terms of generating that final Chromebox alpha. And if so, how many items were dropped. You're going to provide the final number of items in the scale. So even if you started off with 5, you might end up with 3. That's fine. Let me know how many items you have left. You're going to provide the range and anchors. So is it a 1 to 5 scale, a 1 to 7 scale? And you're also going to provide the anchors. What does a 1 mean? What does a 5 mean? And you're going to provide a sample item so that we can see what it is that you're talking about. You're also going to tell me what your behavioral item was and what specifically you were asking. And then you're going to go through how you collected your data. So how did you recruit participants? What was that process like? This doesn't take very long. You can just briefly describe your procedure. When it comes to your results, you're going to be providing the mean and standard deviation of your scale, the mean and standard deviation of your behavioral item, the correlation coefficient, p-value, and coefficient of determination. So as a reminder, the correlation coefficient is your R, and that's on a -1 to +1 range, and that tells you the strength and direction of the relationship between your variables. The p-value is the thing that determines statistical significance, and so a p-value less than or equal to 0.05 indicates it was a significant correlation. The coefficient of determination is taking that correlation and squaring it in order to determine the percent of overlap between the two variables in question. I'll go through an example on the next slide. I want you to identify whether the correlation was significant, whether it was positive or negative, whether it was strong or weak in English. Here's an example of what a results section might look like in PowerPoint. You'll notice I require a lot less formatting here, but I still want you to provide statistical phrases in parentheses like you did for statistics. So here's the mean and standard deviation of the procrastination scale. In this particular example, procrastination scale would be the scale that the group in question was using. And then this group also measured the hours spent Netflixing per week and provided the mean and standard deviation of that. They provided a statement saying procrastination significantly correlated with hours. So we are identifying that it was significant and putting the correlation and p-value within parentheses. We're identifying that it was a moderate to strong correlation, and that we're identifying that it's positive by saying as procrastination increased, hours spent Netflixing increased. And then we're talking about the coefficient of determination. 0.565 squared is 0.32, so 32% of procrastination variance was explained by Netflixing and vice versa. So you can see how that's a fairly big chunk. This would be an example of what I would be looking for with a results slide. For your discussion, you would talk about the implications of your results, whether your results aligned with your hypotheses, and if not, why you think they didn't. You're also going to talk a little bit more about the limitations of your study. Was your Chromebox alpha really poor? If so, that might indicate that your scale was not focused enough and that you might need to develop a better scale in future. Did you have a really small sample size? That might have determined a lack of significant results. You're going to talk about what you would do for further research. And it's important to be careful with your language, to just remember that correlation does not equal causation when you're talking about the implications of your results. If there was a significant relationship, that's all it is, a significant relationship.